The animals now reassembled in the wildest excitement, each recounting his own exploits at the top of his voice. The animals decided unanimously to create a military decoration, Animal Hero First Class, which was conferred then and there on Snowball and Boxer. Animal Hero Second Class was conferred posthumously on the dead sheep. There was much discussion as to what the battle should be called. In the end, it was named the Battle of the Cowshed, since that was where the ambush had been sprung. In January, there came bitterly hard weather. The earth was like iron, and nothing could be done in the fields. Many meetings were held in the big barn. It had come to be accepted that the pigs should decide all the questions of farm policy, though their decisions had to be ratified by a majority vote. This arrangement would have worked well enough if it had not been for the disputes between Snowball and Napoleon. These two disagreed at every point where disagreement was possible. Snowball often won over the majority by his brilliant speeches, but Napoleon was better at canvassing support for himself between times. He was especially successful with the sheep. Of late, they had taken to bleating 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, and they often interrupted the meeting with this. It was noticed that they were especially liable to break into 4 legs good, 2 legs bad at crucial moments in Snowball's speeches. Snowball was full of plans for innovations and improvements. Napoleon produced no schemes of his own, but said quietly that Snowball's would come to nothing, and seemed to be biding his time. But of all their controversies, none was so bitter as the one that took place over the windmill. In the long pasture there was a small knoll, which was the highest point on the farm. After surveying the ground, Snowball declared that this was just the place for a windmill, which could supply the farm with electrical power. This would light the stalls and warm them in winter, and would also run a circular saw, a chaff cutter, a mangle slicer, and an electric milking machine. The animals listened in astonishment while Snowball conjured up pictures of fantastic machines that would do their work for them. Within a few weeks, Snowball's plans for the windmill were fully worked out. All the animals came to look at his drawings at least once a day. Only Napoleon held aloof. He had declared himself against the windmill from the start. One day, however, he arrived unexpectedly to examine the plans. He walked heavily round, looking closely at every detail, then suddenly he lifted his leg, urinated on the plans, and walked out without uttering a word. The whole farm was deeply divided on the windmill. Snowball maintained that it could be done in a year, and thereafter that the animals would only need to work 3 days a week. Napoleon argued that the great need of the moment was to increase food production. The question was put to the vote. The animals assembled. Snowball stood up and set out his reasons for the windmill. Then Napoleon stood up to reply. He said very quietly that the windmill was nonsense, and he advised nobody to vote for it, and promptly sat down again. At this, Snowball sprang to his feet, and shouting down the sheep, who had begun bleating again, broke into a passionate appeal in favour of the windmill. By the time he had finished speaking, there was no doubt as to which way the vote would go. But just at this moment Napoleon stood, and casting a peculiar sidelong look at Snowball, uttered a high-pitched whimper of a kind no one had ever heard him utter before. At this there was a terrible baying outside, and 9 enormous dogs wearing brass-studded collars came bounding into the barn. They dashed straight at Snowball, who only sprang from his place just in time to escape their snapping jaws. In a moment he was out of the door. Amazed and frightened, the animals crowded to watch the chase. Snowball was racing across the long pasture, the dogs close on his heels. With inches to spare, he slipped through a hole in the hedge and was seen no more.
Beasts of England, beasts of Ireland, beasts of every land and clime, hearken to my joyful tidings of the golden future time.
Silent and terrified, the animals crept back into the barn. In a moment, the dogs came bounding back. At first, no one could imagine where these creatures came from, but the problem was soon solved. They were the puppies whom Napoleon had taken away from their mothers and reared privately. They kept close to him. It was noticed that they wagged their tails to him in the same way as the other dogs used to do to Mr. Jones. Napoleon, with the dogs following him, now announced that the Sunday morning meetings would come to an end. They were unnecessary and wasted time. In future, all questions would be settled by a special committee of pigs presided over by himself. These would meet in private and afterwards communicate their decisions to the others. The animals were dismayed by this announcement. Several of them would have protested if they could have found the right arguments. Even Boxer was vaguely troubled. He tried hard to marshal his thoughts, but in the end he could not think of anything to say. Some of the pigs were more articulate. 4 young porkers in the front row uttered shrill squeals of disapproval, but suddenly the dogs let out deep, menacing growls, and the pigs fell silent. Then the sheep broke out into a tremendous bleating of 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, which went on for nearly a quarter of an hour and put an end to any chance of discussion. Afterwards, Squealer was sent round the farm to explain the new arrangement. "Comrades," he said, "I trust that every animal here appreciates the sacrifice that Comrade Napoleon has made. Do not imagine that leadership is a pleasure. On the contrary, it is a deep and heavy responsibility. No one believes more firmly than Comrade Napoleon that all animals are equal. He would be only too happy to let you make your own decisions for yourselves. But sometimes you might make the wrong decisions, comrades, and then where should we be? Suppose you had decided to follow Snowball, who, as we now know, was no better than a criminal." "He fought bravely at the Battle of the Cowshed," said somebody. "Bravery is not enough. Loyalty and obedience are more important. One false step and our enemies would be upon us. Surely, comrades, you do not want Jones back." Once again this argument was unanswerable. On the 3rd Sunday after Snowball's expulsion, the animals were surprised to hear Napoleon announce that the windmill was to be built after all. Squealer explained privately that Napoleon had never really been opposed to it. On the contrary, the plan which Snowball had drawn had actually been stolen from among Napoleon's papers. The windmill was, in fact, Napoleon's own creation. Why, then, asked somebody, had he spoken so strongly against it? Here Squealer looked very sly. That, he said, was Comrade Napoleon's cunning. He had seemed to oppose it simply as a manoeuvre to get rid of Snowball, who was a dangerous character and a bad influence. This, said Squealer, was something called tactics. The animals were not certain what the word meant, but Squealer spoke so persuasively and the dogs growled so threateningly that they accepted his explanation without further questions. All that year the animals worked like slaves, but they were happy in their work, aware that everything they did was for themselves and not for a pack of idle, thieving human beings. In August, Napoleon announced that there would be work on Sunday afternoons as well. This was strictly voluntary, but any animal who absented himself from it would have his rations reduced by half. The windmill presented difficulties. Huge boulders had to be dragged up the slope to the top of the quarry, where they were toppled over the edge to shatter into manageable pieces. It was a slow and laborious process. Nothing could have been achieved without Boxer. To see him toiling up the slope inch by inch, the tips of his hooves clawing at the ground and his great sides matted with sweat, filled everyone with admiration. The animals were not badly off. Nevertheless, as the summer wore on, various unforeseen shortages began to make themselves felt. There was need of paraffin oil, nails, string, dog biscuits, none of which could be produced on the farm. One Sunday, when the animals assembled to receive their orders, Napoleon announced that he had decided on a new policy. From now on, Animal Farm would engage in trade with the neighbouring farms. Not, of course, for any commercial purpose, but in order to obtain certain materials which were necessary. Once again, the animals were conscious of a vague uneasiness. Never to have dealings with human beings, never to engage in trade, never to make use of money. Had not these been among the earliest resolutions passed at that first triumphant meeting after Jones was expelled? Yet Napoleon announced that he'd already made all the arrangements. There would be no need for the animals to come into contact with human beings. He intended to take the whole burden on his shoulders. A Mr. Whymper, a solicitor, had agreed to act as intermediary between Animal Farm and the outside world, and would visit the farm every Monday to receive his instructions. Indeed, when Mr. Whymper came, the sight of Napoleon on all fours delivering orders to Whymper, who stood on two legs, roused their pride and partly reconciled them to the new arrangement. It was about this time that the pigs suddenly moved into the farmhouse and took up their residence there. Again, the animals seemed to remember that a resolution against this had been passed in the early days, and again Squealer was able to convince them that this was not the case. It was absolutely necessary, he said, that the pigs should have a quiet place to work in. It was also more suited to the dignity of the leader to live in a house than in a mere sty. Nevertheless, some of the animals were disturbed when they heard that the pigs not only took their meals in the kitchen and used the drawing-room as a recreation room, but also slept in the beds. Boxer passed it off as usual with, "Napoleon is always right," but Clover, who thought she remembered a definite ruling against beds, went to the end of the barn and tried to puzzle out the 7 commandments. "It says, 'No animal shall sleep in a bed with sheets,'" Muriel told her. Curiously enough, Clover had not remembered sheets, but as it was there on the wall, it must have been so. By autumn, the windmill was almost half built. November came with raging southwest winds. One night the gale was so violent that the farm buildings rocked on their foundations. In the morning the animals came out of their stalls to find that an elm tree had been plucked up like a radish. They had just noticed this when a terrible sight met their eyes. The windmill was in ruins. With one accord they dashed down to the spot. Napoleon, who seldom moved out of a walk, raced ahead. Yes, there it lay, the fruit of all their struggles, levelled to its foundations. The stones they had broken and carried so laboriously scattered all around. "Comrades," said Napoleon quietly, "do you know who is responsible for this?" "Snowball,"